Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is part two of our Seiko John Player Special rebuild, the watch that won the latest viewer poll. I will put a link in the description for this video to part one if you haven't caught that yet. But on this part two, we are going to be doing the full assembly. All the parts have been cleaned and repairs have been made. So we're going to start off here by assembling the mainspring barrel. And what I'm doing is putting some Seiko S4 grease along a few points on the side wall of the inside of this barrel. You can see me kind of putting in little dots of this Seiko S4 grease here. And what I found on one of the last videos is I caught an image of it while I was processing the video where the braking grease, my mainspring winder actually took a little bit of that braking grease back out with it because it kind of touched it when I put it in. So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of spreading out those little dabs of grease against the wall and just kind of flattening them out, which the mainspring normally, does that when it's installed, but I'm just kind of doing that. Now we're going to reuse the original mainspring. I went ahead and flattened it. If you've watched part one, you could saw where there was a little bit of a bend in it towards the coil end. I flattened that out and I'm using a number 7 winder here. And we're going to put this back in. Kind of a bit of a challenge actually to film this. So Seiko's, the bridle is kind of backwards where it's attached at the tip and the bridle goes inward. So I'm folding that inward, kind of pressing it in and then manually inserting it into the drum and then pressing it in a little bit. And then we'll go ahead here once I kind of get it back in frame. And there we go. Wind that back in. And then it's really difficult to show removing the arbor on this. I've done it in other videos, but I really had my hands in the way, so I didn't show that here. So I did not pre-lubricate that spring. So what I'm doing here is putting some Mobius 8200, three little dabs of it on the barrel, and now we're going to go ahead and pop this spring in, just like that. The next thing here is we are lubricating just the inside wall where that arbor is going to sit. And I like to put my arbor kind of on my bench block there and have the hook on the arbor kind of oriented the same way. So when I grab it with my tweezers, the hook's kind of in the right spot. And it helps me. It's just kind of the technique that I'm sure a ton of people use. I kind of figured it out on my own, but I'm sure it's not uncommon. I just kind of fold it in there a little bit and a little bit of lubrication here on the other side of that where that lid's going to sit. And there on that lid, you can see that gear that is going to engage the hour recording wheel. So here we're going to put it on this little tool here that just puts even pressure around on that lid. It just kind of clicks into place. And lastly, I just kind of inspect it under a microscope and just make sure that the lid is seated all the way around. There's not one side kind of tilted up a little bit, or just making sure that it's flush and flat all the way around, that it looks good. And we're not done lubricating that. When it comes time to reassembly, we will address that hour recording wheel gear assembly. Next up, I clean the balance in a separate process with one dip. So after cleaning, I have reinstalled it onto the main plate here. And we're going to begin by cleaning and lubricating the upper and lower shock settings for the balance assembly. So we remove the spring and just use some Rodico to remove that cap jewel. And one more time, we'll remove that setting out. So I'll soak these in one dip. And then after the cap jewel gets out of the first soak in one dip, I have it on a sheet down on my workbench, and I'm using a padded sanding stick, and I have the flat side of that jewel downwards towards the bench. And I'm just buffing that jewel using that sanding stick just to keep it in place. Here's we fold it up there. You can see that jewel. After that's done, it goes back into the one dip, as you'll see right here. Just boop, right in there, and you can see that setting still in there. I'll let that soak a little bit more and then bring it out, let them dry, and then go ahead and assemble these. So that setting just kind of pops on there, just like that. And then I like to use my automatic oiler to oil these, as you see here. And then to inspect it, what you're looking for is a circle, about 50 to 70% coverage on the inside of that. You can see that circle in the middle of there, that oil ring. So that oil's suspended right above where that pivot's going to be. And that's what you're looking for. If something happens, and it happens a lot when you, especially when you manually oil those, if you have a little bit of difficulty assembling the cap jewel and the setting back together, that oil won't be a perfect circle. It'll kind of smear around a little bit. And when you see that, you basically start over, you clean it again and try again. And what you want is that perfect circle. So next up, it's time to just reinstall that spring, that shock setting spring, and we'll go and work on the rear side. This is going to be the exact same process. What we do is we turn this. You can turn them to the right or the left. Doesn't really matter either way. But once you get 2 of those little pins out, that spring can come out. And then one more time, the shock setting and the end stone kind of came out together on that one. And I just kind of hovered over my little 1-dip cup and just tap on the rodico a little bit. And as you can see at the very bottom, you can see the cap jewel and the shock setting, the setting, they separate once they get into that 1-dip. But I buffed this jewel just like the last one. And now we're going to reassemble this and use my little automatic oiler once more. And that tool is actually about $100 or a little over $100, $109 or $110. And I held off for the longest time buying one because it just seemed like an unnecessary expense. And truth be told, it really is unnecessary. You don't have to have one. I've worked on more watches without one of those than with one, but I really am glad I ended up buying that. It's a luxury to have that. I mean, watchmakers for hundreds of years never used one of those, but so you don't have to have one, but it sure is nice if you do. And I didn't buy the whole set. I just bought that one because they make a set of 3 that you can use. They have different needles in them for different applications, but that's the only one that I really find that I need. I'm sure if I use the other kinds, I'd probably end up wanting them too, but I've never tried them. So I think I'm just going to stick with that one. But that spring went in real nice. And now I'm just using this opportunity to look at that spring, make sure it's flat and concentric all the way around. I'm looking at its engagement with the regulating pins. And here I'm working on the focus. You can see those arrows point at the top to the roller jewel and then to the pallet fork and escape wheel jewels, and just making sure that all that stuff is in line. And so our bead error is not going to be too terrible when we put this thing together. And lastly, I've mentioned before how I like to just spin these with a puff of air. Just using my phone here just as a demonstration. I like these to run for at least 30 to 45 seconds. I don't waste your time on the whole thing, but I just kind of, just to show you what I do and how I don't necessarily time it that exacting every time. But with that done, we can begin assembly on the main watch. So this here is the center wheel. And I spoke about in the teardown video how there's multiple ways to assemble these watches first. And traditionally, I always assembled the dial side first. I'd put the center wheel on the center wheel bridge because you have to have those in place to install your Cannon pinion. But I would always install the dial side first because you need the chronograph plate installed on the dial side because that giant hole you see there at the bottom, the mainspring barrel, the arbor goes past that hole, and it's actually the bearing point and the jewel for that mainspring barrel is actually on the chronograph plate on the other side of the watch. So if you want to just at least get your time setting, running first, you have to have that chronograph plate installed. So that's why I would always build the dial side of the watch. But here we're going to I want to just get the time setting done first and just show you a different way of doing it. So here we're going to set up the time setting side of the watch first. So I'm putting the chronograph plate on here, but only this, no parts underneath it or anything. We're going to have to remove this later, but that arrow right there is pointing to where that barrel arbor is going to rotate in. So we're going to go ahead and get this plate put in. There's 3 screws that hold it down. Just get it fully tightened. And then once that's done, we can go through and then build the timekeeping side and get all those components in, error check anything, put it on the time grapher, make any adjustments that are necessary, and then move forward from there. The disadvantage of doing it this way is that, again, you have to take this plate off to assemble the dial side of the watch. And then when you put it back on after your minute recording wheel and your hour recording wheel and all that stuff is there, it makes that plate install a lot more difficult. But there is pros and cons to both. So we're going to do that one this way in this video. And you can reference the bullhead video to see the other way of putting these together. So there, I lubricated the assembly for that gear. There's a couple different lubrication points across that arbor where you need to make it. I didn't really lubricate the main part of the arbor itself. There's a little bit of oil on there, but I'm going to lubricate the barrel arbor properly on the other side of the movement later on. So we get that barrel put in. Now this here is the third wheel, and I'm just kind of moving this around, making sure that that's in its pivot, and there it goes. It drops in. And then the same thing with the escape wheel, just being very gentle and using very light pressure on the tweezers. And once that thing finds its jewel, it'll sit straight up and proud. You'll see that happen here in just a second. There it goes. You can see it find its spot. So next up, we have to lubricate this chronograph wheel. And normally I do this under a microscope at an angle so you can see it, but I wanted to show you how I do it normally when I'm not filming, is I use my bench block here and press down on that pinion, but not on the bushing around it. And then once that's done, then we can lubricate the top part of that pinion there with a little bit of 90-10. And now we can put that into the watch as well. Once it finds the spot, I just kind of let it go and just kind of barely nudge it, let gravity take it down. Then I'll just kind of adjust that escape wheel a little bit and make sure that those things are in line, and the escape wheel teeth on the top pinion are engaging with the chronograph wheel. Last thing here is a part that's easy to forget is one of the winding pinions for the manual winding on this watch. There's one here and there's one it's non-removable on the underside of the bridge here, which you'll see here. I want to put a little lubrication on this point as well. And I think on the bullhead video, I left this part out, but you definitely want to lubricate that as well, just like that. And those two intermediate gears connect with the winding pinion in your keyless works, and then that is what winds your watch manually. So now we can put our bridge on and do our little tapping trick here. And again, the trick to kind of making this work is to not hold the movement. And if you do hold it, just don't hold it solid. Let it kind of bounce around in your hand a little bit and let it create that vibration as you're tapping it. Then I'm going to go ahead and give this a little test. And it doesn't necessarily, the wheel train may not necessarily move even if the pivots are in there, because that chronograph wheel, as you can see, it's not in the upper pivot's not in anything yet, because that pinion goes into the chronograph bridge. But you can usually turn it and get that thing to spin. But even if it doesn't, you can still closely inspect it and make sure that all those pivots are in there. So if it doesn't spin on you, it's not the end of the world, but just kind of be aware of that if you're working on one of these. We get those 3 screws put in, but not tightened all the way. And I'm just going to give this one more check here. Everything seems to be happy and in its home. So we're going to go ahead and tighten these down fully. Not over tighten them like we did, like we found in the teardown. And now I'm going to use this opportunity to check in shake on the rest of the wheel train, just to make sure that everything's nice and kind of how I like it. And I should point out, it's going to be a little bit before you see any more microscope footage. I recorded about 2 hours of video, and I'm lubricating the wheel trains here. But as I do that, I'll note I was recorded about 2 hours straight. And as I was transferring the footage over from the cameras to my computer, the memory card for the microscope camera became corrupt or something. I don't know. All that footage is gone. It was unreadable, unusable. So, and actually, that footage you saw me earlier of lubricating the hour recording wheel that's on the barrel. If you'll look at the bullhead video, that I actually took that footage from the bullhead video because I wanted to show you the process. But I did that exact same thing on this watch, but that barrel that was in that footage was actually the bullhead barrel, because I did not have any microscope footage to use. So I got all the pivots lubricated for the wheel train on the dial side and the rear side. And then we installed our click spring, and now we're installing our ratchet wheel, and I'm having a little bit of a time getting that hole indexed properly on that arbor. So I'm going to go ahead and use two tools here and just kind of rotate that around in place, and right there, it's set down, and get that one screw tightened. In order to actually get it properly tightened, again, you have to use something to press up against that wheel to stop it, and my little plastic hold down tool seems to do the trick. And you want to make sure you have your wheel train lubricated before you put this cover plate on, because that covers the escape wheel completely, upper pivot, and there's access to the third wheel, but that little bearing you see right in there, that is the bearing for the intermediate minute recording wheel. Next up here is some lubrication. We're going to put the column wheel on. So we lubricate the post there and just put a little bit of a dab of it on that raceway. And then we install this bearing or bushing. If I can install it. There you go, mess with it a little bit. And then one more dab of oil on the outside of that. There we go. And now I can put on our column wheel. So as I kind of fiddle around with this and try to get this into place, that little spring you see there with that indexing arm above that column wheel, you need to pull that out of the way, just like I'm doing right there, and kind of get it out of the way. That way that column wheel can sit down fully, which again, I'm having a little bit of a time kind of getting my hands to do what my brain wants them to do. But once I finally get it in, you can release that spring, and then that column wheel set in place, and we can go ahead and get our screw in and tighten down fully. And again, I'm trying to keep in mind that, you want these tight, but these are very small screws, so you don't want them overly tight. And now there's a lot of different lubrication points here. So I'm going to speed the video up just a bit, but you need to lubricate the horizontal teeth on that, and then some spots on the columns themselves. I'm lubricating that operating lever and that channel that it rides in, and then the reset lever there. There's a couple points in there as well. So I'm just kind of working this over. And before everything's done, we'll go through and work this grease in, operate the mechanism, and then I'll go back and use some Rodico to clean up a lot of that lubrication after we're done. But we got that done, and we also got the posts for these coupling levers and for the hammer lubricated as well. So we're going to start off by installing the first coupling lever. That's going to be secured in by one screw. There we go. And then I'm going to use this opportunity before putting the second coupling lever to put a dab of grease on this little point here on the first coupling lever, because that's where the first and second coupling levers are going to engage one another. But with that out of the way, or with that lubricated, we can put this first coupling lever in. And this here is actually another one of the advantages of installing the rear side of the watch first, is installing the second coupling lever. Because if you do the dial side first, there is a part that's got an arm that extends through, that when that second coupling lever pulls away from the chronograph wheel, it engages that lever, and then that's what releases the brake on the arrow recording wheel to allow it to start moving. If you do the other side first, that lever's kind of in your way when you pull that arm, and it's kind of a fiddly process to kind of get it installed. But that's one of the advantages of doing it this way. In my opinion, though, I still like doing it the other way better. But again, one of the benefits of doing it in this order. But after both of those are in and tightened down, I've gone ahead and used a little bit of Rodico to clean it up. And I'm using a little bit of grease here to engage with it, put in where that first coupling lever engages with that column wheel. Now we can put in our operating spring. So I just kind of put it in place here, use my finger just to kind of cover it and hold it down. That way it doesn't move around. And then I'll use my tweezers here and just kind of pull that onto that other post. Just like that. I actually slipped, but it managed to go in. And then once that's done, we can install our hammer next. So I already lubricated that post earlier. So now that the hammer's down, we can then use a bit of 9010, and I will put some lubrication right here on the striking faces of the hammer where it engages the chronograph wheel and the minute recording wheel. You could do it that way. You could also lubricate the hearts on the wheels themselves, but I mean, it's pretty easy just to lubricate the hammer. Next, it's time to install the hammer spring. So I got it wrapped around those first two posts, but there's really no tension when it's just on those first two. And I'm using my hold down tool to kind of keep it in place. And we're going to get it around this third post here, which sometimes can be a challenge, but one thing you really want to make sure is that that spring is really pushed in there into that recess on that post. And then we'll bend it around here and finish the installation. Next up is the minute recording wheel. So we'll put a little bit of lubrication on the pinion there and then drop it straight down and let it kind of go all the way through the movement. There we go. And the intermediate minute recording wheel. And there is no lubrication on that part, top or bottom. There's actually so little pressure on that wheel that if you put lubrication on it, it becomes a hindrance because there's just that wheel is only pushed by the finger that's on that chronograph wheel, and it uses very light pressure. So there's no lubrication on that. So next up, we're installing the chronograph bridge, and these can be a little bit tricky. But once you kind of find the pivots there, and I move the hammer click spring out of the way, making sure all the pivots are in place, and I'm just going to keep the tool on there until I get at least 2 screws in here. And I'm not tightening them down fully. I'm just kind of screwing them down till they stop, but really with no pressure. But as you can see here, even kind of with this weird angle, we'll go ahead and get this second screw in. And once that's kind of on, then that plate's not really going to go anywhere. And I can remove my tool and we can finish with the third screw. And once that's tightened down fully, I'll just kind of check free movement of everything. And you can see I have the chronograph engaged, and all the way from moving that barrel till you see that minute recorder wheel turning, it means everything in that gear train is turning fully. And once that we're good there and I know everything's in place, then we'll go ahead and just kind of give those just a little bit of a turn to tighten them down properly. And next up here, I'm applying some grease for the hammer click spring. I'm applying it to the spring itself, but then I also apply a little dab on the post on the hammer that actually spring sits on. And right now it's not sitting in place. It's sitting away from its final position. But once we have that spring on, now we can go ahead and set that spring in place just like that. And if you find that it's really, really difficult to engage your mechanism, to engage your reset, you can adjust the tension on that spring and make it easier, tighter. That's what gives you that tactile feel. That's what gives you the click, and also, how easy or difficult it is to do that. But once you kind of get that in, we're working those around a little bit. And here I'm going to rotate. See that our recording wheel? Watch that arrow and see that wheel kind of move. I'm moving it to where I can see kind of a hole in the wheel here, and then we're going to reset it and reset it back into position. That way you can kind of see that everything is right there is engaging properly. I also checked right then on the first reset. I had my eyes on the chronograph wheel just to make sure it reset properly. So next up, I am applying some 90-10 here to the upper pivot for that chronograph wheel. And now we can go ahead and install the pallet fork. And this footage would be a lot better, again, if I had my microscope, but I don't. So all that footage that normally I would put in the video at this point in the watch rebuild would be from the microscope. But again, I didn't really have it. So we'll just kind of make do with what we're getting here. And that's why the picture kind of looks the way it does. I have the light on the microscope turned pretty high. So that's why you kind of see some glare there. But when you're looking through the microscope, it looks fantastic. But we'll get those kind of tightened down a little bit. And then I'm just going to check free play here a little bit. That looks great. So we can actually just tighten those down fully. And once that's done, I'm going to just put a couple turns. You'll see here, not a full wind by any means, just a few turns on the mainspring itself. Just put a little bit of a wind in it. And then I'm going to check and make sure that this pallet fork is engaging and disengaging, locking and unlocking, and that everything's kind of looking good. And it seems to be working pretty well here. I mean, you just want to use the absolute lightest touch. You don't want to push it all the way across. You just kind of want to get it started and see if it kind of springs over to the other side. So what you don't see here is me lubricating the escapement, because there's really no way to show that other than with a microscope. So since we don't have that, I did lubricate the escapement. I can refer you to basically any other video on the channel. It shows that process if you want to see that. But we're going to go ahead and get this balance in. I'm having a little bit of a time getting this thing to go, but there we go. Now that thing kind of set in place, and I'm just making sure that this bridge is fully seated on both sides before we go any further. That seems to be okay. And now we'll go ahead and get these 2 screws down. And that's always just the most satisfying thing I find. It probably is for most people, watching that balance finally come to life. There's some where, I mean, thankfully, really the watches that are on this channel, none of them have really been too terribly difficult to get those balances in, but I've certainly had them in the past. I've, especially when I started learning, I had cap jewels switched around or whatever, but when you finally get it going, man, it feels good. So I put a full wind in the watch, complete full wind, and I let it run for 24 hours. And these are the initial results after 24 hours of running on the power that it had left in the system. So 210, 212 amplitude. That's, I mean, it's not bad at all. It's actually pretty good for this watch. It's well within spec. I'd like it to be a little bit higher. I'd like to see it in the 220 range, but it's not the end of the world. I think if we change the mainspring barrel or the mainspring, it would probably be there. But I mean, this watch is a runner. That's good numbers for this movement. I'm very pleased with it. I've seen better, but this is just fine. Real good, especially with the original mainspring. So now what I like to do is remove power at this point when we're building the watch this way, because I want to remove as much tension on the wheel train as possible. Because now we have to remove that chronograph plate. So I don't want any wind in the mainspring barrel. I mean, I've seen videos where people keep the watch running for that whole process, and it seems to work. But it just seems like I'm asking for things to happen if I have a wind in there at this point. So removing the wind just kind of releases as much tension as possible. And now we can begin assembly of the dial side. And we're going to begin with the keyless works. And this here, part that we're lubricating first is going to be the winding pinion. So we put some Mobius 9415 grease on that, on the mating face of that, where it's going to meet up with the sliding clutch. And we're putting more on its mating face on the sliding clutch here as well. Kind of get that in. Kind of push those two parts together. You don't have to, but. And then next up here, I'm applying more of that same grease to the stem, to a couple different points on here where the setting lever is going to engage, where it's going to rotate in the main plate, and then a dab on all four sides of the flat where it's going to go into the sliding clutch, and then right on the very tip. And now, as you notice here, we have microscope footage again, by the way. So we're going to go ahead and we got that stem in. Everything's looking good. Next up, we need to lubricate the part on the sliding clutch where the yoke is going to go. And it's on the sides of that recess where the sliding clutch engages, not on the bottom. But and then a little bit more grease here, right in this hole in the main plate, and that's going to be where the setting lever axle is going to go into. Speaking of which, here it is, seated in place. And here I'm applying some grease to the contact points where the yoke is going to engage with the setting lever. And then that little nub on top of that setting lever is where the setting lever spring is going to go. So I'm applying just a bit there. And on the back side of that watch is where there is some contact with the quick set, a little arm on the edge of that quick set mechanism. And then some posts here for the setting lever spring and for that long part that I'm not going to repeat the name of. It's just that tiny little, that rocker arm. And then one more here, just a tiny bit of dab of lubrication on the side of that yoke. That's where the spring is going to sit. I don't know. Whenever I see that part, I think of boomerang. So whenever I'm looking around, I'm like, where's my boomerang? That's what I call that part. It's easier to say that than whatever, that 8-word, part name Seiko gave it. But you notice here when I put that setting lever spring in, that kind of came forward a little bit, and it's not in its proper position. It's like 5 or 6 millimeters too far to the left. So I'm trying to figure out how to fix this without removing it. And so I ended up just kind of twisting it a little bit with that hold down tool and kind of squeezing that spring a little bit. Now I'm going to hold it down with my tweezers. And now I think I have enough room here. I'm going to see if I can slide this to the right and get that where it needs to be, right there. And I'd prefer not to do it that way again, because I was like, this is either going to work or I'm going to lose this spring. And thankfully it worked. But now the spring is in its proper spot. We can put our setting lever spring in place. And that's called the setting lever spring. It's also a hold down tool. It puts downward pressure on the setting lever. So I'm putting the screws in, but not tightening them down fully. I need a little bit of room underneath it for now. because this here's the quick set mechanism, and it's all kind of one piece. All this gear assembly and all that is held on by rivets and all that. It doesn't really come apart. Lubricating a few specific points on here, and then you need a little bit of room underneath that. And there's the post that it rides on, a little bit of lubrication there. So I'm using one set of tweezers here to pull that spring back away from that rocker arm, away from the boomerang. And now we can install our quick set mechanism, and see that finger on the edge of that on the far right hand side of that part. The spring needs to ride on the top side of your view of that little arm. Once that's in, now I can release that spring. And now when I'm keeping pressure down on that quick set mechanism, I can install this plate here. And now once that's done, I am also using this opportunity to lubricate the setting lever spring itself just with a bit more grease. Again, it is overkill, and then I'll clean up later what we don't need. I'd rather have too much on there than not enough when I first start moving this around, because that's a really high friction point, and I just don't want to overstress any of those parts. So there we go. And I noticed my yoke had kind of popped out, but I managed to put that and the yoke back into place right there. And now I can finish tightening the setting lever screws. And I'm holding down that part again just to make sure it doesn't raise up. Because if it's raised up slightly when you push those screws down, you might have problems. So I just make sure it's all the way down and flush, and then put the final tighten on your setting lever screws, and hopefully everything's good. And you'll know it's good if you put it in quick set mode and you move it back and forth, and see how easily and freely it moves to the left and the right. And that wheel doesn't really raise up, or that quick set mechanism doesn't raise up. If your spacing is a little off or something, these can be a little bit tricky, especially when you first start doing them. There's usually a little bit of a gap between the underside of the setting lever and the top side of that quick set. And that little gap allows it to raise up a little bit when you first start engaging it, and it won't move as freely. So that's an easy way to watch that quick set mechanism when you move that wheel back and forth. And if it starts raising up, you know that you got something off. But once that's all in, the keyless works is good. I'm applying some grease here to that center wheel post, and I noticed I had a bit of Rodico there on the tip of my chronograph wheel pinion. Get that cleaned off. Now we can put our cannon pinion on. That's just held in by friction. And we had previously lubricated the post in the raceway for this minute wheel. That's in place. Next up, I'm applying a little bit of lubrication. This is HP 1300 on the outside of the cannon pinion, and that's where the hour wheel is going to go. So go ahead and get that put in place as well, and make sure the teeth are engaged properly with the minute wheel. And then we have the intermediate calendar wheel. And on the 6139s, which is the single register chronograph, it looks to be this same identical part, but it's actually flipped the other way around, where that shorter pinion on there is actually downwards towards the movement. On the 38s, it's upwards. But after that's done, we can start lubricating the posts here, all the different posts here for the rest of the chronograph mechanism. And all the stuff for the chronograph on this side of the watch is for the hour recording wheel. So I lubricate all the different posts for that. And we're going to start off here with the hour recording wheel stop lever. And that part is what engages with the hour recording wheel itself, and it keeps it from moving when the chronograph is disengaged. So here, this is the intermediate hour recording wheel stop lever. And you want your chronograph to be in the non-running position when you put this in. That way the coupling levers are not in the way, and that thing will drop in. If you find that it's not going in and you're having a hard time getting it going or getting that wheel to index properly, hit your chronograph start stop button, and you should be fine. So next up, we have our spring here. We'll go ahead and we got that set down and put into place. We put a little bit of grease there, and I'm moving that stop lever back out of the way, and you can kind of see just that tiny little movement in that intermediate wheel. That's what engages and disengages. Well, that's so we're applying a little bit of grease here to that intermediate stop lever. And that is where the hour hammer is going to ride. There's a pin on the underside of that hour hammer that we're installing here that's going to ride in that channel. So we grease that up. And then this post here on the left where I'm seating it, that can be a little bit tricky to get on there sometimes, but get that in, and then you push down on that intermediate arm, and then that stud on the underside of that hour hammer finds its groove, and we're set. And now is the flyback lever itself. And that post that it's sitting on that's at the top of your screen, that's actually an eccentric screw that is adjustable, but generally speaking, if you don't mess with it, you don't need to mess with it. So everything seemed to function on this thing, so I'm not going to mess with that, but we're applying a little bit of lubrication here where it's going to contact that hour hammer itself. And there we go. Next up here, I noticed that hour hammer had kind of come off its pin a little bit, so just getting it kind of seated down there properly. Make sure that flyback lever's in place. And now is the time to install our flyback lever spring. And so that spring on that end around that eccentric pin, I'm getting that in and just kind of making sure it's around that top post. And then I'm just going to use my same technique here again, just with my finger to hold it down. And there we go. We get that set in place, and then just pull that in and put that on the other side of that post for the hour hammer. And there we go. Those are not too terrible at all. Next up, I'm applying a tiny bit of lubrication here to the bottom pivot for the hour recording wheel itself. And sometimes you may need to kind of push this in and kind of push that stop lever out of the way and just kind of get it in there. And now you have to be really careful because we're going to install this chronograph plate, and you've got the tiny little pivots for the minute recording wheel and the hour recording wheel. You need to get in line. The bottom barrel arbor also has to go in, but that one's not too difficult, but you got to be real careful putting that down. So we're just going to use a little hold down tool just to kind of make sure it doesn't raise up or move on us. Give it a couple screws going here just to, be safe before we remove that tool. Here we go. Had a bit of awkward silence on the last video where I just took forever to put in screws, and it's kind of happening here. So this is me filling the void rather than just having dead air. I don't know, maybe these videos need some background music or something. I need to sign up for one of those little music services and have like some background blues guitar or something. That might be cool. So now we need to check the reset function, the flyback function of this. So you see me turning that hour recording wheel, and I'm going to press this, watch this wheel. Boom. That tells you all that is engaging properly, and all the linkage between the flyback lever, the hour hammer, the intermediate wheel, the brake, and all. I mean, everything's releasing like it should. And we'll do it one more time here. Just move that wheel and then reset it. Boom. That's exactly what you're looking for. So that's working great. And we can go ahead and keep going here. And while I have this, I'm putting the slightest amount on this is kind of like an intermediate gear wheel that's attached permanently to the chronograph plate. And that's what engages between the quick set and then the star gear on the back side of the day wheel. But we're lubricating the 2 pivot points here for the hour and minute recording wheels. Next up here is some lubrication for the calendar works. So we can go ahead and get that installed next. We'll start off here with the calendar driving wheel, and then we'll get the day and date fingers on there. And I want to take this opportunity just to let everyone know we did create a Patreon page for this channel. We've had some people sign up. I want to say thank you to everyone who has it. It means the absolute world to me. It really does. So I try to upload fresh content on there. I've got some videos for some other watches that have not made it on this channel yet that are still in progress. Really cool pocket watch. It's part of my own family history. I did a balance staff replacement on that. We have a video on there for that. Try to engage and answer every question that I can on there. Every person who signs up, regardless of what level, there's a thank you packet. You get some really cool. There's some stickers and thank you cards, and I have some other stuff in the works. But if you'd like to support the channel, please take a look at our Patreon page. It means a lot to me. So thank you for everyone who's joined, and thank you if you want to go take a look at it. So assembling here the date wheel, and once I kind of get this in the spot, you need to pull this date jumper back a little bit, and it's not really what you need to pull it back where so it engages with the teeth on that date wheel. But it didn't want to go, so I'm kind of moving the date wheel around to kind of arrange the teeth in such a way that there we go. Now I could pull that spring back, and now you saw it kind of went in between two teeth there, and that's what we're looking for. After that is this cover plate. This cover plate covers that spring and also has the spring on it itself to index the position for the day wheel. But this is held on by 3 screws. So we'll go ahead and get these put down in place. I find that these screws, probably among most of them on any of these watches, these seem to be the most chewed up. You know, if a watch does have a lot of markings from previous people who've worked on it, those screws, for whatever reason, seem to have the heads that are most chewed up of, you know, any watch. And there's some markings on some of these, but it wasn't bad. But you'll come across some, especially if you work on a lot of Seikos. Those are always, make sure you dress your screwdrivers on some of those. You really need to. So we're checking here just the quick set first. That there is moving that. You can see where I rotated it around the other way and turned that little gear. And now we have it in manual time setting mode, and I'm rotating this around. Everything seems to be in working order. No issues there. So next up, we can go ahead and get our other cover plate on. This one here, I probably should have put this on before I did the test, but this one here, that's just secondary cover plate. It just kind of captures the teeth on the other side of that day wheel. It does function technically without it, as you just saw, but that needs to go on, and then our day wheel can go on. So we get that pressed down, and now I'm going to zoom in on the microscope. I use an old oiler here and pull that little, you know, setting spring out of the way, and then bring it back in to where it engages with 2 teeth on the star gear on the underside of that day wheel. And now we just have this little C-clip. Just make sure that the rounded side goes down when you do these, and the flat side goes upwards. That way the next person to work on the watch, if it's not you, can get that clip off. And now we're just doing a function test one more time, just to make sure that everything is working like it should. The quick set again seemed to work great. Manual time setting, that works good too. So we're all good here. There's really no problems. Everything's feeling pretty solid. This is the dial spacer. So we got the holes lined up on that. Get that pressed down into place. Next up, we can install our dial. And this dial is made, I've had my eyes on some John Player specials for a while, and I have never seen one with a dial this good, original dial. I mean, I've seen some that are nice, and you know, they may even say they did a dial swap. And there's some people out there who do make very good aftermarket dials, but this one is original, so I could not be more pleased with that. So now we are setting the hands. That is the hour hand. We're pressing on the minute hand here, and you can see it's looking pretty good. You know, you can see we repaired that spot on there, and I mean, if you didn't know that it was repaired, you would never know. I'm really pleased with the color match and how that turned out. And now we are installing our sub-register hands, and these take just very light pressure, and they don't even go on that far. I mean, even when it's off the post, it's barely on there. But just very light pressure to install those. Don't muscle them by any means, because on this particular holder, those are not supported on the back side like that center is. This little blue holder here, and you notice on the left there, I'm holding the chronograph reset in the entire time when I'm doing both those sub-register hands and this chronograph seconds hand, this hand here, that the reset's fully engaged where it's in its, that way I want these things to reset exactly where I'm pressing them down on. So here we go. We'll get that set in place. I'm just going to kind of just give it one more little tap for good measure. And then I can release the reset. Just like that. So next tip here, I just want to do a test to see what the reset looks like, because these are, these hands, the pinions on there, they have like a spade cut to them, like almost like a shovel. And they kind of cut a channel into the hand the first time they're installed. So, you know, you want to make sure that if you're putting especially new hands on, you get one shot basically on these. I mean, you can reshape these and redo them again, but that's looking good. You can see that minute recording wheel. indexing over like it should. So let this thing run for a while, and now we want to test the reset on everything. So we'll go ahead and stop it right there. I'm going to readjust a little bit here and go ahead and do a reset. I want to see where all these hands line up. And that's pretty darn good, if I don't say so myself. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get the front side of the case off, because I was going to put the movement in first, but I noticed it, there's very little space to between the top of that case and then the chronograph seconds hand. So I'm going to go ahead and get all these parts in and get the crystal in before I put the movement in the case. So when I flip it over, there's no possibility of anything getting hurt. So we got the chapter ring in, the tachometer ring, that little chrome trim piece, and then the crystal gasket. And here we go. We'll go ahead and put this crystal on. I cleaned that crystal gasket. It's a Viton gasket, so I cleaned it in some 99% IPA. And now we can go ahead and put our bezel on there. I'm just going to get this bezel on. And there's really the only way to orient this. I mean, there's nothing different all the way around, but if you notice where that cutout was when we disassembled it, I made sure that was in the same spot where it's accessible again. Because, some of these points here where the case raises up, there's really, if you accidentally put that, that cutout for that bezel behind one of those, you can't really get a tool in there. So I'm putting some plastic down and just pressing that bezel in place lightly. And I'm just going to work it around a little bit. I don't show the whole thing, but I just press it down, turn a little bit, press it more, turning a little bit, using these plastic dies, because I just don't want to mark accidentally that bezel. So this arrow here is pointing to that little mark that I mentioned in the other video, where that's going to line up with the cutout on that tachometer ring, that chapter ring. And you'll notice that they line up. There won't be a space gap between those two parts if those parts are lined up properly, but that's looking really good there. So go ahead and flip this moving over and get in there. And that thing is looking sharp, I gotta say. So now I am applying some silicone grease to both of for the pushers and for the crown stem. We'll put that in there, and I also put some silicone grease on the washers themselves, on the gaskets. But I found that sometimes I don't put enough on there or something, and they can all become very hard to turn or push in. And it's because there's not enough silicone grease on there. It's just something I found. So I lubricate them this way, and then I've never had a problem since I started doing it. But we got these pushers in. I got brand new gaskets on there, brand new springs. I did not clean and reuse those old springs. I consider those consumables really in these movements. They're not difficult to find. They're not terribly expensive. So now we're going to go ahead and push both of those in. And now with those in, we can drop our movement ring in place, and that's got the tension spring already on it. Once that's in, I'm finding it's just a tad bit off here, so I'm just kind of adjust it just a hair. And there we go. Then you can release your pushers, and they're captured by that movement ring. Now we're going to lubricate the lower pivot for the Automatic Works transmission wheel. Get that put in place. You can see now that part doesn't have all that gunk around the edges like it did before. That cleaned up very nice. And the base plate for the Automatic Works, it just indexes on 2 posts. Sorry, 3 posts. Now we're applying some lubrication here to the underside of this. And the manual actually, tells you this is a pretty high friction point. It says to use grease. I've used grease. I've also used HP 1300. Really haven't, found much issue with it. But you do put a lot on there. Be liberal with your grease at that spot. You put your paw lever on, and then we can go ahead and put this thing in place. There we go. There, it dropped in. And the next thing you want to do before you tighten it down fully is make sure your paw levers are on each side of that transmission wheel. So moving that paw lever around. There we go. Now it's on the edge. That thing's sitting down, and we can go ahead and get these screws in. There's 1, and there is 2. The next thing I like to do is lubricate the bearing. And also, after this is done, I will lubricate the transmission wheel. So again, I had my microscope. The focus on the camera is separate and independent from the focus on the microscope itself. So I dialed in my focus for the microscope, and everything looks great, but the camera is way off. So the close-up, real zoomed in footage was unusable. So that's why you saw it this way. But next up here is the upper pivot for that transmission wheel. Just a little bit of lubrication in here. And here we go. We're going to go ahead and put these little one dab on each side of that transmission wheel. Just like that. And then we'll go ahead and work this thing around. And that moves that lubrication around, but I'm also watching this transmission wheel. And you notice how the transmission wheel is turning counterclockwise, regardless of which direction I turn that bearing. And that tells you that that's working properly, that paw lever is doing its job, because that you only want that transmission wheel to rotate one way, but moving the barrel either way means that regardless of which direction that oscillating weight turns, it's going to go ahead and wind that watch. So that's exactly what we're looking for. So we get the oscillating weight put in here, and I'm just using my little hold down tool to brace that wheel. That way we can tighten it properly. There we go. And lastly, I just want to give this a little test, rotating this wheel around several times. I want to make sure that it's not rubbing against anything. Just generally, I checked also the bearing just to see how much free play was in the bearing, and it was just fine. So next up here, it is time to go ahead and lubricate the caseback gasket. Notice I put a different camera lens on this thing. I have a little bit of a wider view. Normally this is the super close-up view of that camera, but I just changed the lens on it to, it's actually just a cheap lens that came with the camera, but it has a kind of a wide angle. So we're going to go ahead and get this on there. And this is a flat gasket. So what you want to make sure when you do these is you get that gasket put on, but you don't want it kind of to ride up on one side of that flat. So what I'm doing here is just kind of making sure that it's sitting down flat all the way around. And we got one little spot here left. There we go. Now it's sitting flat all the way around. So we can go ahead and get this put into place. And as you can see, I did not touch the finish on this. It's still in the condition I got it. It's just clean. So I think right now it would be a disservice to this watch to refinish it. And the only way to properly do it at this stage, to do it justice, would be to use a lapping machine, which I do not own, which are very expensive. One day I'll have one. But I think this watch, it has character in the way it is. So here I'm using the tool here, and we're going to go ahead and tighten this case back down properly, using some plastic there just to make sure that I'm not adding any new marks to this watch. So here, this is a replacement bracelet. The original two-tone bracelet was on there, was not original to the watch. In my opinion, was dreadful. So this is a Seiko UFO style bracelet for the UFO or Yachtsman watches, which I own one. And this came from Uncle Seiko. It's a very good bracelet, but as you can see, the case is 19 millimeters lug width, and that bracelet has end links for a 20 millimeter, so it does not fit. So what I decided to do was just to put it in a vise here with some plastic. That is about a 90-year-old file. It's part of I started off with a coarse file and started working those things down, and then went to finer files. But that file I got from the family of a retired master watchmaker. Super cool story on those parts. One of these days I'll share that with you. I want to make sure that there's a newspaper article I'd like to share. I'd like to get approval from his family first before I share that. But those tools have royal provenance. It's such a cool story. I really want to share it with you, but I want to get his family's permission first. So we got both of those filed down, and now, what do you think? I think this watch turned out beautifully. I think that bracelet looks great. The original bracelets are really hard to find. I might find one. I'm going to wear the heck out of this watch in the meantime, though. Finally managed to set up a decent shot here. I really think that shows off how gorgeous this watch is. I mean, it's unreal. So I also decided to take this thing into space, and on my way to the ship, our alien visitors actually came to visit me. So we chatted for a while. They said, "Hey man, cool watch." And then they went ahead and took off. So that was cool. I ended up not going to space just because they came to me. So there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the video. Seriously, I could not be more happy with the poll results. Thank you for choosing this watch. It was an absolute pleasure to work on. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, I really would appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and we will see you on the next one.